Hello friends, good morning and welcome to EduSat Live Lectures. Dear friends, as you know that we started a series on marketing management, and today we are conducting yet another lecture in the same series. In today's lecture, we will try to understand the concept called consumer behavior. In that, we will try to understand its meaning, need for understanding consumer behavior, the buying decision process. To discuss this topic, we have with us our subject expert, Dr. Garima Gupta. Dr. Gupta is Associate Professor in Faculty of Management Studies, University of Delhi. Without further ado, I would like to welcome ma'am to our studios and request her to start the lecture. Welcome ma'am.
Thank you. Okay students, today we would understand the meaning and need for understanding consumer behavior and the entire buying decision process. It is very important to understand that marketing is built around the value philosophy. And it is very much important that for a value philosophy to be undertaken, a marketeer must understand who actually a consumer is. We can define consumer as a person who is willing to pay to consume the goods and services produced by a seller. Which means that if I want to buy, say, a bicycle for my son, or I want to buy a sari for myself, both my son and I become a consumer. Let us now try to define consumer behavior. According to the definition given by American Marketing Association, the dynamic interaction of affect and cognition behavior and the environment by which human beings conduct the exchange aspects of their lives can be termed as consumer behavior. A simpler definition is provided by Kotler in 1994, according to which consumer behavior is the study of how people buy, what they buy, when they buy, and why they buy. It is very important for every marketeer to understand and know who his consumers are and know the essentials about consumer behavior and the buying decision process. The entire marketing strategy is woven around consumer behavior. Therefore, it becomes pertinent to understand what are the mechanisms through which a consumer passes through before he or she finally zeroes on a purchase choice. This is furthermore important as no longer can we take the consumer for granted. There are certain reasons behind it, like the diverse consumers connect with each other and with other elements. Students, it is very important to appreciate the fact that each individual is distinct, and when the diverse consumers interact with each other, they give rise to a different kind of a behavioral pattern which a marketeer must understand. There are various factors or elements that impact their choices while exercising a purchase decision with respect to goods and services. Different consumers also exhibit a different kind of need set and motives. Say for example, my purchase behavior would be governed by what my need set is as against the need set of a different consumer who may be looking for the satisfaction of a different need or motive. A firm also has to be constantly innovating in order to understand the latest consumer trends and tastes. Marketing, therefore, cannot be standardized because one has to devise all those strategies which are in line with the consumer's need set. In order to understand it better, it would always be important for a marketer to understand the cross-cultural styles, habits, tastes, which therefore prevents standardization of the marketing strategies. It is around the knowledge of the consumer behavior that a marketer ultimately tries to formulate his overall marketing strategy in terms of 4 P's, that is product, price, distribution and promotion. In all, we can sum up by saying that all marketing managers must become astute analysts of consumer motivation and behavior in the sense that they should understand the consumer buying motives behind making various purchases. However, decoding consumer behavior has never been easy. It is dependent on various psychological processes that underlie the consumer choices. These psychological processes are in the form of attitude, learning, perception, and the various other behavioral aspects. Even extensive marketing research and consumer research often fail to correctly predict consumer behavior. The case in point is that of Coke. where even after taking a lot of extensive marketing research, the flavor of new Coke was not appreciated by the consumers, and therefore various other insights were drawn by the company in the subsequent time period to improve on its product. The consumer also does not go by these set rules. The fact that the consumers are driven by their own need set, the entire behavior of the consumer largely remains unpredictable, and the marketeer has to make a constant effort in order to make this unpredictable behavior predictable in nature. This requires an understanding of multiple disciplines, in the sense the consumer behavior knowledge is largely drawn from various disciplines like psychology, sociology, economics, and so on. And therefore, in order to completely understand consumer behavior, one has to build on all these knowledge disciplines. This eventually helps in selection and segmentation of target market, because a complete understanding of consumer behavior helps a marketeer in rationalizing its offerings to the need set of the target market. Therefore, more focused strategies can be formulated. Also, it helps a marketeer in understanding the consumer motives, choices, and preferences in terms of understanding why he is buying a particular kind of product, what are the choice set that he undergoes, and what are the preferences that ultimately drive the consumer behavior. This helps in devising the appropriate marketing strategies which are relevant to a particular target segment group. The evaluation of marketing program often are based on a complete understanding of consumer behavior, and the companies draws largely from the inputs that it generates out of the study of consumer behavior. It also helps the marketeer in assessing the trends of change, so that the existing opportunities can be tapped and the existing products can be modified and can be improvised in the light of the consumer behavior. This also provides invaluable clues towards the new technological frontiers. As to whatever technological changes they are happening, they can be duly roped in terms of the offerings which the marketeer presents to the consumers. Let us understand whether the entire behavioral process is a rational one or an emotional one. It is important to understand that consumers do not always make decisions in a rational, deliberate manner. Many purchases are arrived at through unconscious habitual process. It is very important to understand here that the consumer's level of involvement play an important role in the entire buying decision process. This level of involvement is basically categorized into two heads, that is high level of involvement and low level of involvement. So much so that the buying habits generally vary depending on the type of goods, the consumer characteristics, the purchase situations, and the technology. Like for example, the type of goods can be classified as convenience goods, shopping goods, specialities, and services. Now, a consumer will not behave in a similar fashion while he or she is exercising consumer behavior with respect to convenience goods as one would behave in case of buying the speciality. For example, the convenience goods are the goods which are bought on convenience. For these kind of products, the consumers generally exhibit a low level of involvement. These products are generally small priced unit price items for which the consumer does not go for an extensive information search and normally ends up buying the product which he or she has bought in the past and is comfortable with. Therefore, the consumer generally exercises a habitual buying behavior. This is unlike in the case of the purchases where the consumer is deliberating on buying products like say car, refrigerator, laptops, where an extensive degree of information search is required and the consumer will go through an extensive buying decision process. The consumer characteristics in terms of value that he or she is looking for and the time that he is willing to spend in terms of searching for the information before zeroing on a particular kind of a purchase decision also affects the entire decision making process. There are certain purchase situations where the consumer may end up buying different kinds of goods and services from a single store, or may make a decision to buy different items from different stores. There are technology platforms like people have started preferring e-retailing. They are into online shopping a lot, and these kind of things provide a different kind of a behavioral dimension. Let us understand what is by and large the buyer's decision process. As you can see, it is a 5-stage model where the consumer starts from problem recognition, goes on to a pre-purchase information stage. There are evaluation of alternatives, purchase decision to be taken, and finally a post-purchase behavior. Let us understand all these stages one by one. Let us begin with problem recognition. This is also known as need recognition stage. We can say that the process of buying starts with problem or need recognition. This need may be overt through peer pressure. Let us have an example here. Let us say Saurabh wants to buy a laptop. He is a management graduate and he wants to purchase a laptop so that he can prepare for his presentations in the class, and he can also finish up his assignments well in time. All the friends of Saurabh also have a laptop. His father also needs a laptop every now and then in order to cover his office work. Now, after recognizing the problem and after talking to his friends, Saurabh realizes that he should very soon buy a laptop. After recognizing the problem or the need, Saurabh would look for all the alternatives which are available. That is, we now understand that the recognition of a problem, which may be internal, external, which could be there in the form of an internal stimuli, or I can understand it with the help of an external stimuli, helps me to understand what kind of options are available. Saurabh would now move on to a pre-purchase information stage where he would look for all possible sources of information that can give him possible alternatives to choose from in terms of laptops. He could exercise this kind of an information search from various sources. There could be internal and external search. There could be personal sources like friends, family, peer group. There could be commercial sources like, say, advertising, dealers, displays. There could be public sources in the form of mass media advertising that he can resort to. All these sources of information will present him with information related to various brands of laptops. After getting all this information and collecting all this information, Saurabh would now enter into evaluation of alternatives, where he would evaluate various brands of laptops on certain product attributes, like for example the memory, configuration, operating system, size, price, and so on and so forth. He would also assess the relative importance of each of attributes and will assign certain weights to these attributes. Brand image at this point of time forms an important parameter. On the assessment of all these parameters or attributes of laptops, Saurabh would finally make a decision as to which particular brands of laptops he would finally like to consider. Many product characteristics, therefore, are involved in making a consumer buying decision. Say, for example, in some cases, he may exercise the rule of thumb like buying whatever brand of laptop is cheapest, whereas in some of the cases, the ranking of the attributes in his mind may overrule his decision making. Let us understand the Howard and Shades evoke set model in this regard. When the consumer is faced with the decision of buying a product or a service, he is practically exposed to all brands that are available in the market. But all of these brands may not be the brands that he knows of. So, there are certain brands that he is aware of and there are certain brands that he is not aware of. The brands that he is aware of enters his awareness set. From his awareness set, he would choose certain brands that would be acceptable on the basis of the parameters that he wants or the parameters that he has chosen, and there may be certain brands that he rejects because those brands do not fulfill his parameters or the consideration set. All those brands that finally enter into the consideration set, he is going to make a decision to buy one brand out of those brands, and the final brand which a consumer chooses as the one that he wants to buy therefore becomes his preferred choice. Let us now understand the purchase decision. The consumer may end up buying a brand which is not his most preferred brand. This generally happens because of two factors. One, attitude of others, and the second, the situational factor. For example, at the time of making a final purchase decision, Saurabh's friend Rajendra suggests him a brand which probably is not his preferred brand, but he ends up knowing that all of the friends in his circle are actually possessing a brand which he should also go for. The situational factors like the competitors dropping their prices, or there is a certain kind of environmental factor which may impose a restriction on buying his preferred choice, may alter decision making at the end of consumers. Let us understand the final stage in the consumer's buying decision process. This is the consumer's post-purchase behavior. Often after making a purchase, there is an evaluation which is done at the end of the consumer, where he constantly compares his expectations from the brand with the product's perceived performance. The gap between the expectations and perceived performance often causes discomfort or dissonance to the buyer. In order to reduce this dissonance, the consumer often re-evaluate the chosen brands or search for information to confirm his choice. We can also understand dissonance in the sense of the discomfort that the consumer experiences on choosing a brand that he has finally opted for and missing out or losing on the brand that he has not chosen. The satisfaction or dissatisfaction may be with respect to the use or the disposal of the product. Here, the role of the marketeer becomes very important, because a marketeer has to present information with respect to the product which a consumer has chosen, so that he can reduce his dissonance in the subsequent time period. Here, mechanisms like providing the good attributes of the product, presenting with the after sale services, can help the consumers in reducing their dissonance. So, students, we have understood that there could be different types of decision making which comes into force, like there could be a complex buying behavior, there could be a dissonance reducing buying behavior, there could be habitual buying behavior, and there could be variety seeking buying behavior. Which particular buying behavior a consumer is going to exhibit again depends on the kind of products and the services he wants to buy. Say for example, the consumer is looking for a new brand of car. Now, we know that this is a kind of a buying behavior where the consumer is going to exercise a detailed buying decision process. He would understand the need for buying a car and then would go through various brands which are available on offer, and he would be evaluating on various aspects, various parameters before zeroing down on a particular model of car. Therefore, students, we can understand that the type of buying behavior which a consumer is finally going to go for depends on two broad parameters. The first parameter talks about the level of consumer involvement, which could be high or low, and the second talks about the differences that a consumer naturally finds in brands. If there are significant differences between the brands, a consumer would definitely like to go through an extensive information search before zeroing on to a particular brand. As against this, if he could not find any significant differences between the brands, then the products in those cases are largely substitutable and he would not mind altering his choice of preference. In that case, the consumer may fall on his instinct, his intuition, or may end up buying the product which he has already bought or used in the past. Therefore, the consumer experience with a particular product also may drive his buying behavior. When it comes to consumers' complex buying behavior, we can understand that consumers are highly involved in these kind of purchase decisions and perceive significant differences amongst the brand. The product that they generally buy is expensive, it is a risky kind of a purchase and is purchased infrequently. The kind of purchase decision cycle that one can exhibit in this case starts from learning more about that particular brand, forming a belief structure about that brand, formation of attitude, which finally results into a purchase choice. Marketeers of high involvement product category therefore must understand the information gathering and education behavior of high involvement consumers. Some of the products with respect to which the consumers normally exhibit a complex buying behavior include purchases of refrigerator, laptops, apartments, car, high expensive jewelry, and so on and so forth. Let us understand the second kind of buying behavior, which is dissonance reducing buying behavior. As has already been stated, in the entire purchase decision process, consumers do exhibit a high level of dissonance once the purchase has been made. The consumers are highly involved in this case, but they fail to see significant differences amongst the brand. Therefore, after the purchase, they usually experience a sales discomfort or a purchase discomfort. In case of habitual buying behavior, these are the conditions where the consumers have a low degree of involvement and generally see little differences between the brands. The consumers, as a result, may not search extensively for the information about brands. Rather, they go for the brands which they have already bought in the past and they are satisfied with the same. Here, we do not infer that the only reason for buying these are the level of satisfaction or dissatisfaction. There is no particular change or there is no particular significant difference that the consumer notice between the two brands. Largely, this becomes the reason for their ending up buying the same product which they have bought previously. Repetition creates brand familiarity rather than brand conviction, and the only reason for buying is the products being highly substitutable in nature. The price and sales promotion in these conditions are used to stimulate the product trial. The last one is the variety seeking buying behavior. In this case, the consumer exhibits low level of involvement but could identify significant brand differences. This is similar to a situation where the consumer wants to try a new product only because there are multiple choices available in the market. For example, you want to buy new dress, you want to buy new brand of snacks or cookies. It is not that the consumer is not satisfied with the product and therefore he would like to try new options, but it is basically the variety that the consumer is looking for that drives his consumer behavior. In these cases, the consumers therefore exhibit a lot of brand switching and they keep on trying new kind of products and services only because they are looking for variety. Therefore, consumers must go through an extensive information search process if the decision making is with respect to a complex product, whereas they may skip some of the stages of the buying decision making in between, like they may not go through an extensive information search in the cases where the decision making involved is in the cases of habitual buying behavior or falls in case of a variety seeking buying behavior. Most of the consumers, we would understand, go through this buying behavior process, but the extent to which they would be relying on an extensive information search or they would be relying on their intuition or they would be skipping some of the stages depend on their level of involvement and to what extent they find significant differences existing between the brands which finally enter in their consideration set. Students, even after going through the entire decision making process, it is very difficult for the marketeers to understand what kind of buying behavior the consumers are going to exhibit at the end. This is largely because of the fact that the marketeers are dealing with the consumers, which, as I said before, remain largely unpredictable. There are many factors which guide the consumer decision making process, like their own personal factors, the life cycle stages of the product, the macro environmental factors, certain organizational factors, culture, subculture, social system, psychological processes, and at times it becomes very difficult for a marketer to have a complete in-depth understanding of all of these aspects. Thank you. Hello students, after understanding how a consumer behaves, let us today try to understand the various types of decision making, the organizational buying behavior and the various participants in the buying decision process. As we know that the consumer generally follows a 5-stage model while making a purchase decision, which starts from problem recognition, pre-purchase information search, evaluation of alternatives, purchase decision and finally a post-purchase behavior. Now let us understand to what extent the household buyer's behavior differs from the buying behavior of an organizational buyer. At this point of time, we do know that a household buyer generally follows a different kind of a buying decision behavior where he or she may be exercising a complex buying behavior, dissonance reducing buying behavior, habitual buying behavior or a variety seeking buying behavior. Let us now try to understand how this buying behavior differs for an organizational buyer. Let us first try to understand who is an organizational buyer. So students, an organizational or a business buyer is one who buys goods and services for any or all of the following purposes. 1. Making other goods and services. 2. Reselling. And 3. Use as consumables or supplies or service items in the organizations. Therefore, a business buyer is a buyer who does not buy the products, goods or services for his or her ultimate consumption. Rather, he prefers to add value to those products and provide these to the other buyers. Therefore, let us understand what are the distinct factors which can help us in differentiating an organizational buyer from a household buyer. Let us understand that the buying motives in terms of a consumer, that is a household buyer and a business buyer are completely different. While the household buyer buys for his or her own consumption, the organizational buyer primarily buys for adding value to the product which is then sold to the another consumer. It is very important to understand here that whereas the household buyer may buy directly for his or her own consumption and therefore exhibits a direct demand for the products, the business buyer usually goes in for a derived demand. That is, the demand is derived for those who are ultimately going to use it. Like for example, if I am into car manufacturing, my demand for steel forgings, tires and the other parts may be driven by the kind of automobiles which I am producing for my ultimate buyers. The size of the buyer. One needs to understand that the household buyer is relatively smaller, in the sense that the household buyer or the buyer which buys for his or her ultimate consumption usually buys in small unit quantities. This is the reason that retail buying is very much prevalent with the household buyers. As against this, the organizational buyers usually buy in bulk or large quantities. The third factor which can distinguish the organizational buyers from the household buyers is the kind of risk in purchases which is undertaken by both of them. While the risk in organizational purchases are higher, the household purchases, the risk is less, especially in respect of the products with respect to which the consumer usually exhibits a habitual or a routinized kind of a buying behavior. It is very important to understand at this point of time that in case of organizational buying decisions, it is generally the joint decision making which is involved. The organization is divided into number of departments and there are number of people who at the same time would be involved in the decision making process. Whereas in case of a consumer buying or in case of a household buyer, the decisions generally are individual decisions, especially when the products are consumers non-durables. With respect to consumer durables, even in case of household buyers, the consumers may exhibit a joint decision making where all the members of the family jointly decide on the kind of goods and services that they want to buy. Let us understand the other aspects on the basis of which we can differentiate between an organizational buyer and a household buyer. The next factor is concentration of buyers. Organizational buyers are generally concentrated in the same geographical area. Say for example, you would find the automobile industries or the manufacturing plants set up near Indore, Madhya Pradesh. Therefore, a tire company may find all these automobile firms to be situated at one place only. Whereas, if the same tire company wants to cater to the replacement tire need of the consumers, those consumers are scattered all over the world. The nature of the purchase decision. It is also important to appreciate that the nature of decision making which is involved in case of organizational buyer is different from that exhibited by a household buyer. The decisions on organizational purchases are usually taken up jointly. As I have mentioned before, there may be various participants that are involved in the organizational buying decision making. A purchaser may be quite different from a person who decides on what to buy, could be very different from a person who initiates the decision making. This also happens in case of consumer household buying, where there are number of people involved in the purchase decision. Like there could be an initiator who initiates the decision making, there could be an influencer, there could be a decider, there could be a consumer, and so on and so forth. However, we find that when we categorize the products as consumer durables and non-durables, it is with respect to consumer durables that we find consumers exhibiting joint decision making, whereas usually with respect to consumer non-durables, where the consumers buy products like soap, shampoo, bread, butter, convenience kind of goods, shopping goods, in those kind of product categories, even the household buyers exhibit an individual joint decision making. Therefore, it could be said that the nature of decision making which is involved in case of organizational buying is very different from the nature of decision making which is there in case of household purchaser. Let us come to the next factor, which is the adherence to the specifications. Students, it is very important for a marketer to understand the specific need for which any buyer, be a household buyer or an organizational buyer, is placing an order for the products and services. The organizational buyer usually do not accept any deviations from specifications. This is because he is buying on the basis of derived demand of his customers, and therefore his demand is to be undertaken with respect to those specific aspects which the ultimate consumer wants to have. On the other hand, the household buyer is buying for his own need set, and therefore his demand is generally the direct demand for which he wants to buy the products and the services. In this case, the household buyer may not be so rigid while exercising the purchased decision and is often in a position to substitute or compromise on the products and services. He may not exhibit that kind of a rigid behavior when it comes to adherence to the specifications. Let us understand who all are the participants in the business buying process. As I said, there could be various kinds of people who would be involved in the entire decision making process. In fact, the participants in the buying decision process are diverse, both in case of household purchases, also in case of the business buying decision making. Before we understand the participants in the business buying decision making, let us quickly go through the participants that would be involved in consumer buying decision process. It could start from an initiator to an influencer to a decider to a buyer to a consumer. Let us say I want to buy a new car in the family. It could so happen that the decision making gets initiated by the children in the family who wants the parents to go for a new car. Therefore, the children in the family in this case may act as an initiator by bringing to light various cars and the brands which are available on offer, and wants the mother and the father to go for a new car or to buy a new car. In the second stage, there could be an influencer. The influencer could be the friend, the peer group, or any other person who can influence your decision making with respect to which particular brand of car one would like to buy. The decider is generally the male member of the family who decides as to which finally the car that would be bought in the family on various parameters like, say, the price, the value, and the various attributes of the car. Again, it is important to note that the influencer and the decider may be the same person or the different person. Then comes the buyer. The buyer is the person who usually makes a final decision to buy a product or the service, and then the consumer. Let us now understand the various participants in the business buying process, starting from the first one, which is the user. As against the initiator in case of household buying, it is the user that starts the purchase process in case of organizational buying. Users are the members of the organization who will use the product or service. These are generally the people who work at the floor level in the organizations. So, the technicians or the people who work at the ground level generally form the users of the organizational buying decision making, as these are the people who are ultimately going to work on the plants or the machines, and they are more familiar with the processes which are involved therein. This actually becomes a very important participant group in the organizational decision making. Second comes the influencers. Influencers, these are the people who often help in defining the specifications of the products, the order for which would finally be placed with the suppliers or the vendors. And these are the people who generally provide information for evaluating the alternatives. As it happens in case of the household buying, that the consumer undergoes a lot many multiple level of attribute comparison, so is the case with the organizational buying decision making, wherein the influencer compares the attributes of the various products which are available through the vendors and the suppliers, and therefore makes a decision on the basis of what is actually required by the user. We can also understand it in this way, that the user presents the need set or the requirements to the influencer, and the influencer finally influence as to what kind of products and services would be bought, or for what kind of products and services an order would be placed with the suppliers. Third comes the buyers. Buyers may be the people from the purchase department or the material department who would finally be making a purchase requisition and would be buying the goods that would be required in the organization. These buyers, they have a formal authority to select the supplier and arrange the terms of purchase. We can also understand here that the buyers may be quite distinct from the other participants, but they also have to go by the influencers, because they look up to the influencers to finally place the order for various products and services. In fact, the users, influencers and buyers may at times have to work in tandem. Then comes the deciders. Deciders in an organizational setting, they have a formal or an informal power to select or approve the final suppliers. Eventually, the deciders would be getting in touch with the buyers and influencers before they place a final order. Then comes the final participants in the organizational decision making, and these group of people are known as gatekeepers. These are the people who control the flow of information to others. The gatekeepers could be people like, say, receptionist or supervisors or people who have access to some information, and they may help the marketeers in pitching in for their products and services at the time of making an organizational purchase. Students, let us try to understand what could be the by and large nature of the business buying decisions. As we have understood from the preceding discussion, the business buying decisions are generally more complex in nature as against the consumer buying decisions, which may range from being complex to dissonance reducing to variety seeking to habitual buying behavior. By and large, the reason why we find business buying decisions to be more complex in nature is the fact that there is a high cost and high risk involved in the organizational buying as against the household purchases. Also, the amount that often is spent from the organization side on buying various kind of products and services may run into lakhs and crores of rupees. While when it comes to the household purchases, we generally do not spend this big amount of money, especially when it comes to the purchase of the convenience goods or the shopping goods. The buyer do not have that kind of risk factor inherent in the purchase, which is often there in case of organizational buying. We also can understand that the business buying decisions are generally more formalized than the consumer buying decision process. As I have stated that in case of organizational buying decision, there are a number of participants involved, and each of the participant has a definite role to perform in the entire decision making process. At times, there are written requisitions which are to be presented from one participant group to the other participant group, which makes the whole system more rigid and formal in nature. We also find that in some of the organization, the buying decision making is very distinct in the sense that there are organizations that follow the centralized buying decision process, whereas there may be some organizations where there is a decentralized buying that happens. Now, what is the difference between the centralized and the decentralized purchases? Where in case of centralized decision making, all the decision making is done at the point of action. So, there could be one top management that would be passing on the orders and instructions with respect to what kind of goods and services would be bought, and all the regional branches and all the outlets would be following those orders and instructions. Whereas in case of decentralized kind of decision making, all the individual regional branches and the outlets can follow their own decision making. So the decision making is more decentralized and is situated at the point of action rather than with a central group of people. We also understand that in case of organizational buying, the buyer and seller are often much more dependent on each other. Why? Because the buyer and the seller, they have to work in compatibility with each other. The reason is that they are working towards the demand pattern which they have derived from the ultimate buyer. It is very important therefore for an organizational buyer to understand what actually are the specifications and the need requirements of the one who would finally be buying the products from them, and naturally in accordance with those specifications they have to place the orders to their suppliers and vendors. Let us understand what can be the major influencing factors when it comes to the business buying decision making. Now, business buyers, they also are influenced with a number of factors. Some of these factors are in their control, while there could be factors which are beyond their control, or some of the factors over which they can exercise very less control. Some of these factors are environmental factors, organizational factors, interpersonal factors, and individual factors. Let us first understand the environmental factors. These are the factors such as the level of primary demand, the economic environment, the economic outlook, the cost of money, or the shortages in the key materials, or the technological, political and competitive developments in the environment. Now we know that some of these factors like the technological environment, the political environment, the government regulations, these are the factors over which an organizational buyer has little or no control. Therefore, largely the organizations, they have to adapt their strategies to whatever is happening in the external environment. And these environmental factors are naturally going to affect the choice and the decision making that they would be exercising with respect to various products and services. The second set of factors are the organizational factors. These are the factors such as the objectives, policies and procedures of the organization. As I told you, there could be a centralized or a decentralized purchasing system in an organization, which is the policy of the organization to either go for centralized purchases or a decentralized purchases, and therefore the entire purchase decision making would depend on whether one has to wait for the orders and instructions and the approval of various products and services that are to be bought in the organization, or there is a decentralized decision making wherein the various departments can themselves independently decide as to what kind of products and services they would like to place an order for with their respective suppliers and vendors. In order to reduce on the wastages, sometimes the organizations, they prefer the centralized decision making, but when it comes to the limitations in the form of time, cost and the wastages involved, at times decentralized purchase decision may also be preferred by organizations. We also can talk about the interpersonal factors and the individual factors. These are the factors which again influence the organizational decision making, such as the age, the role, statuses, personality, attitude, which affect the organizational buyers. When it comes to the interpersonal factors, one has to understand the aspects such as authority, status, empathy and persuasiveness. For example, each and every person who is working for an organization assume a certain role and status, and that role and status governs what kind of decision making one can exercise and how much authority and responsibility he has to share at the time of making various purchase decisions. The individual factors like age, education, job position, personality and the attitude towards risk also influence the business buyer's decision making. Say for example, a person who is young in age may fail to provide that kind of conviction to the management to go for a particular kind of purchase of product and services than a more experienced official in the key position. Therefore, one has to understand the various factors and forces which drive the organizational behavior. At times, it becomes very complex for a marketer to completely align and understand the factors and the forces which govern the consumers' overall buying decision making, be it a consumer, household buyer or an organizational buyer. And this is the reason why we find most of the marketeers going in for segmentation strategy, where they completely understand the segment of the buyers that they would be targeting eventually, so that they can understand and they can completely follow the buying decision process of the segment that they have chosen. In nutshell, we can understand the business buying decision process like this. There is a supra-system environment which poses certain constraints, opportunities and threats to the business buyers. The buying decision process usually undergoes a series of stages, starting again from the need recognition to the final decision, and at various levels is governed by the influence which is exhibited by the interpersonal, organizational, individual influences. The buyer responds by making a particular product or a service choice the decision is also based on the supplier choice, the order quantity, delivery terms and times, service terms and conditions, and the mode of payment or the payment mechanisms. These are the factors which the organizational buyer often takes into consideration at the time of exercising the purchase decision. So students, we have understood in depth what is the buying decision which is followed by a household buyer and how this household buying decision is different from the organizational buying decision process.
Dear friends, on that note, we would like to thank Dr. Gupta for coming to our show, and we hope, dear friends, with today's lecture, you were able to understand the concept called consumer behavior. On that note, thank you, dear friends, watching our show. Stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you.